Policymakers may be reluctant to embrace reality and no doubt also reluctant to believe it, but Europe and other democratic allies no longer have a trustworthy security partner in the US. The post-World War II alliance with the US is gone, and what remains of the West needs to move quickly to secure itself as well as the democratic values that it holds. Edward Hunter Christie is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He served as a NATO official from 2014 to 2020, holding successive roles relating to defense economy, strategic foresight, and technology policy. Welcome to Silicon Kurt. Thank you so much to everybody who supports the channel. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed, of course, but also become a patron or bought me a coffee. We also have had a fantastic fundraiser, which I'm endlessly grateful to people for helping to buy the trucks that we drove over to Ukraine in January. We also have another fundraiser on at the moment to help buy drones on behalf of a Ukrainian charity. And you can see various sort of interviews, and we've got an episode coming up which details their work. So please do help with that kinetic support of Ukraine. It's never been more important than it is now. Edward, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And it is an extraordinary time. I mean, I'm trying to put these videos out almost as soon as they're made because what's discussed is very quickly superseded. Could you give us a little bit of a summary where we are now? Because things seem to be accelerating, and in the last couple of days, it does seem that the mask has slipped. Is it an illusion, or is Trump actively working for a Russian victory?
I think Trump clearly has practiced strategic deception against Ukraine and against the European interest because his exact choices of words just before he was inaugurated and even in the few days afterwards, apart from uncontrolled leaks, what he was actually saying and posting on his own social media platform sounded more optimistic. There was one message in particular, listeners may recall, I think very late January, where he essentially pressed on the fact that the Russian economy was vulnerable and that Russia could do this either the easy way or the hard way. So at that time, which is only about 6 weeks ago, many people, including myself, I have to confess, I had a small bump in optimism. I thought, okay, Trump is not only going to leverage against Ukraine, he's also going to leverage against Russia. And I honestly believe that. And I thought, well, who knows? Maybe all the negative stories that we heard for many years about Trump possibly being a Russian asset or something else is wrong with him that we should worry about, that maybe that was overblown, that maybe after all, now that he's in power again, maybe he doesn't have the incentive or the need to bend over to Russia's preferences. But what we've seen in the last 5 weeks or so is the very worst case scenario. And it goes entirely in the direction of pressuring Ukraine artificially, rapidly. And we see absolutely no sign of any pressure against Russia. On the contrary, we see the Trump administration, and that's the entire administration that Trump obviously completely controls, making promises of future geopolitical and economic cooperation with Russia. That was an outcome of the Riyadh talks involving notably Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov, and everything else that Trump has done, including what he has said against Zelensky, including the éclat that happened in the Oval Office about a week ago. All of that points extremely clearly to the United States arm twisting Ukraine extremely hard, deliberately harming Ukraine's ability to defend itself, and creating a sort of a set of false narratives which are closely aligned with Russian state propaganda to generate excuses and pretexts to arm twist Ukraine even harder and even faster. So to my mind, there's no question that what Trump intends to do is to enact a forced surrender of Ukraine very strongly on Russia's terms.
And I want to sort of mainly focus on the foreign policy side, but it also seems, and this is perhaps more supporting evidence of the hypothesis that is, acting further in Russia's favor, he seems to be dismantling the US soft and indeed hard power, as well as its intelligence infrastructure, potentially making the US incredibly vulnerable, but also I would perhaps argue turning it into a bit of a basket case, which ironically is what Putin originally wanted to achieve in Ukraine.
Yes, that's very true. And I think that's where the analysis can be differentiated, and where I think every objective analyst is still looking for more detailed clues or insights as to what exactly Trump is trying to achieve. But it is true that on the one hand, there's this idea of deconstructing the administrative state, which was championed already a long time ago by Steve Bannon. And that seems to be a pathway, or maybe an intermediate trajectory to transforming the United States into a right-wing authoritarian regime, or maybe even into a dictatorship, by effectively first destroying the points of resistance against a personalist authoritarian regime. So you need to destroy the control mechanisms that the federal bureaucracy naturally poses. It would be the same in any other democracy. So first you destroy that, and then later on you would rebuild it in a different way, in a way that suits the executive power. So I think that's one thing that's happening, and that's why American nationalists are on board with what's going on. So American nationalists were not necessarily especially pro-Russian, but were simply interested in a far-right nationalistic authoritarian America. And then on the other hand, there's the pro-Putin aspect in this, where we already see decisions which are publicly announced, they're not hidden at all, where we see America dismantling specific mechanisms and policies that have been irritants to Russia, and also to some degree to other rival states. But basically dismantling USAID, that was an extremely shocking decision. It happened extremely fast, and there is no justification whatsoever for a state to do that to its own overseas development agency. There is not a single sort of domestic ideological discourse that is recognizable by any serious person that would justify doing it in that way with that speed. So the idea that the notion that, oh well, it was full of woke projects and that nonsense needs to stop, that's a lie. That's a cover, obviously a fig leaf, because even if it were that case, and even if you did believe that you know that they want to stop the woke projects, presumably they would also want to keep the non-woke projects, and presumably they would take a little bit more time to review that work. So obviously this is basically an assassination operation against projects that are irritants, notably for the Russian Federation.
And of
Uh,
course, yeah, sorry.
yeah, I mean, anything that has to do with protecting democracy in countries that are the targets of the Russian Federation, including Ukraine itself, because God knows what the long-range plan for Ukraine is, but in places like Moldova or Serbia or any other place where USAID had been helping local NGOs and others to have better democratic standards, that kind of thing, that's all gone. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
And of course, certainly on social media and stuff, we tend to focus on the more obvious figures that are spouting, Russian propaganda, usually the more absurd ones like Tucker Carlson. But this is a mechanic, isn't it, that sort of works very much like Vladimir Zhirinovsky. You put up some outrageous clown saying things that are barely credible, and you know that they're not credible. Meanwhile, there are other assets and figures who have a far more, let's say, hybrid role, whether they're indeed conscious of it or not. Could you comment on this idea that it's Russia's aim not just to sort of capture the sort of clownish figures and clownish end of politics, but also to seed its messages throughout? So you have people who are still considered by some serious commentators, such as Mearsheimer and others. You have to actually create sort of certain intellectual propositions that help to advance Russia's interests. And I think in Mearsheimer, and maybe to a slightly less overt way, you've got someone like Samuel Charap. There are many, many figures throughout the geopolitical ecosystem that have been sort of drip feeding ideas that ultimately are beneficial to Russia and ultimately not beneficial to Western power, democracy, and I would say any concept of justice and sovereignty.
Of course. I mean, I think maybe the category error that some people make, sort of implicitly, it's not necessarily a planned category error, is to imagine that different countries in the world believe in different things, and therefore they will logically align with certain ideas in other countries and not with others. But of course, that's not the game Russia plays. Russia plays to win. And if Russia if Russia finds useful allies or even useful idiots, pretty much in any corner of US society or European society, they will somehow try to exploit those. It doesn't really matter where those people come from. It doesn't really matter whether those people are China hawks or so-called realists or so-called intellectuals or Christian conservatives or I don't know, sort of a veteran communist. It doesn't really matter who it is. Russia will try to exploit every single possible point of vulnerability in order to get the United States to do what Russia wants, because that's the goal. Just like within Russian politics, there's a famous sort of expression to talk about the controlled opposition. So indeed, you can have fake opposition figures, you set them up, that they are front persons or front organizations, and you make them say things that may apparently look like they're disagreeing with you, but in reality, they're helping your project. And now Russia has the commanding heights of the American political system, apparently wanting to do its bidding. It's Trump, it's JD Vance, it's Elon Musk, of course. It has a whole part of the right-wing commentariat of the United States backing this line with indirect arguments. You mentioned Mearsheimer. That's obviously a case. Mearsheimer clearly has been cultivated by the Russians. I mean, I'm saying apparently, very clearly, apparently has been cultivated by the Russians. And there's other figures, and Samuel Sharapov, of course, is a further example.
And one of these ideas that seems to have captured not just some of the sort of geopolitical imagination, but also some people inside the US, so State Department and others, is this idea that there's this three-dimensional chess going on, and Trump is trying to peel China away from Russia, or Russia away from China, rather. Could you comment on why this idea is attractive? Whether it's another, smoke and mirrors type operation, and then ultimately why the idea is fundamentally absurd. Because my understanding of Russia is that the US is and has been and always will be the number one adversary. And just like their ambition was to deconstruct and take over Ukraine and insert a puppet regime, the ultimate aim of Putin and his acolytes has always been to dismantle the US, its power, and, if possible, foment a civil war there. Is Trump falling into that trap, or I mean, what's your take on that idea?
So there's a certain. So first of all, I fully agree with your point that Russia fundamentally, just think about Russia's incentives as an aggressive, highly ambitious world power. Not only do they have strong resentment against the United States because they feel the United States collapsed their great country, the USSR, and there's a spirit of revenge going on there among Russian nationalist elites, including Putin himself. So there is a fantasy, first of all, that Russia could collapse the United States to make the United States go through what the USSR went through in the early 1990s. But in any case, even without that additional element, which is clearly there, if you think about Russian state power as your absolute priority in religion, which the Chekist leadership in Moscow does, then it's not enough to capture the White House and to have them do your bidding some of the time, because that might still be unreliable. You're much better off making sure the US is not even able to hurt you. And so indeed, collapsing the United States will remain a goal of the Russian Federation, a maximalist goal. As for the idea of the Russia-China triangle, of course, it's always been a dubious proposition. And I belong to the camp of people who think that Kissinger and Nixon were actually wrong, that probably even that opening to China, certainly the Americans seem to regret it now, given how powerful China has become. I'm not even sure it was a good idea the first time around. I'm very suspicious, and I think everybody with a healthy mind should be suspicious of this kind of massive, super large scale, extremely primitive form of chess where you think the world is made up of three pieces that act like coherent entities that you can control and that you can switch on and off. It's obviously not that simple. So I don't think it even worked that well the first time. And this time it cannot. I don't think it can work. But I also believe further that I'm not even sure that Trump even wants to do that. And I think the goal in any case is more cynical. So I think the reverse Nixon is a narrative. It's a false narrative. It's designed as a smokescreen, indeed, to take your very own words. And I think the Trump administration knows it. Basically, the audience is prepped, and especially US audiences, but also many international relations scholars are sort of primed to expect something like a reverse Nixon because the first Nixon already happened. And then people can debate that, whether it can work or not. But in reality, I'm not even sure that that's what the US administration wants. If you look closely at a recent interview that Marco Rubio gave to Breitbart, I think if you read, I would encourage every listener to go and read that interview and to look very carefully at the wording. What Rubio is actually saying is Russia is becoming much too dependent on China. And so effectively, we're going to help Russia to be not so dependent on China. And by implication, this means that Russia will be able to choose whether it wants to cooperate more closely with the US in future or not. But the point is they'll have a choice. That's effectively the justification. It is not necessarily a US-Russia alliance against China, and that would probably be impossible. What Rubio seems to be implying is a future world in which there are three privileged states, the US, Russia, and China, all three, not by coincidence, the major nuclear armed states of the world, and that those three would be in competition and partial coordination where they can agree, and in competition when they can't agree. And that would be a new sort of three tripolar world, and that effectively what the US is doing is rescuing Russia from the costs of its own errors and enabling it to be one of three poles. So I think that's what they actually want, and I think that's what Trump can live with because he definitely is pro-Russian or very, very friendly to the Russian state and to Putin. There's no doubt about that anymore. And on the other hand, the Russia-China relationship is quite intimate and quite close. So I don't think the United States would be able, even if it wanted to peel Russia off China. I think that's just simply not possible. And I suspect that properly informed Americans even know this, although I would fear some of them don't. But in any case, I think the future is more likely America deliberately choosing to extract Russia out of the strategic hole it has dug itself into and allow it to be a major power again. And I think that's the insane, frightening prospect that we look at. And from a European perspective, that necessarily means Russia being much stronger again and absolutely in a position to coerce and threaten Europe for decades to come without a proper American pushback against it, and possibly with China continuing to support Russia. So the adjustment variable here is European security. European security is going to have it as a result of this vision.
And I could go in a million different directions here, but let's sort of follow up on the role of the EU, because technically the EU is a nuclear power bloc, or at least you have France and Britain with a deterrent. There may be some questions now about Britain's deterrent and the ability to independently control that without the US wrecking the systems. In this grand vision, which very much sort of seems to represent all this, the concert of great powers, and we're back to the Kissinger kind of model, which actually I rather suspect that via Charup, the Biden administration bought into. They didn't want to see Russia collapse, and therefore they did not want to arm Ukraine for a substantial and unambiguous victory. I will definitely sort of comment on that. But what's the role of the EU in here? Is the EU seen as another power, or is it seen as an impediment to this new world order? Or is it seen simply as something that is not got sovereignty, the so-called sovereign democracy or sovereign power, to use the sort of Dugin concept? Does Trump genuinely look at Europe and say, hey, that's Russia's sphere of influence now?
It's quite. I don't know if Trump considers that all of Europe is naturally Russia's sphere of influence. That would be an interest. It would be interesting to know that. Certainly, Russia would like all of Europe or a large part of Europe to be Russia's sphere of influence. But to get to your point about the EU specifically, I think we have to face the reality that both Putin and Trump, in common and very clearly and openly, view the European Union as such, the EU project and its institutions and its powers, as an impediment. Why an impediment? Because the old principle of divide and rule applies. At the end of the day, the European Union is a collection of 27 sovereign countries, The largest of which, in terms of population and economy, is Germany, and Germany is much smaller than either the US or Russia, and certainly doesn't have comparable military power to Russia, let alone the United States. If you look at it from a hardcore power perspective, obviously and that's the danger here. There is a common interest, an alignment of interest between Russia and the Trumpian United States to prevent the EU from functioning properly. And Trump has done this very openly through the trade channel. Already during his first term, he was actively trying to strike trade deals with individual European countries. And Europeans kept on having to tell him, yeah, but you can't do that because they don't have the power to sign anything valid with you. If you want to modify tariffs, you go through Brussels. And I don't think that's going to change, by the way. I think Trump is making a big mistake by being openly hostile to the European Union. He's only proving to the Europeans that he's out to get not just the EU project, he's also out ultimately to harm essential interests of core EU member states who've invested so much in this project over so many decades. The likes of France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, etc., have their identities bound together with that of the EU and the EU project. And so they're not going to bend. They're not going to say all of a sudden, they're not going to flip all of a sudden and say, oh, yeah, you're right. We're going to be better off just being France or Germany or Italy. That's not going to happen. And so the more Trump presses on this, I think the more this will strengthen the EU ultimately.
Let's turn to what Trump is actually doing to benefit Russia, because there was a good comment by Anne Applebaum, I think last week, that Trump has rescued the Russian economy. But it seems to be going far, far further. He seems on the point of lifting sanctions. He seems on the point of trying to deconstruct the oil price cap. Now, we know with declining oil prices, if the cap remains in place, Russia is pretty much screwed no matter how Trump tries to help them. So this seems to be a key priority. He's helping them on the battlefield. It's now absolutely unambiguous by disabling HIMARS, ATACMS, withdrawing intelligence data and various other moves, as well as suspending aid and preventing the aid that's already mandated from actually reaching its destination. He seems to be helping, the Russian war aims. Could this go further? He's preserving Putin's regime. Ironically, Biden also helped preserve the regime by slow walking aid. Could he go further? Could he physically help the Russian war machine to restock by providing, say, machine tools and other things? Is this going too far, or is anything, on the table at this point?
I think for a good analysis, it's useful to lay out a wide range of scenarios, including very ugly and extreme ones, and then just consider them calmly. And a shout out to European governments. I think doing this kind of foresight analysis is incredibly useful, and obviously European governments need to plan their policies accordingly, even taking into consideration ugly scenarios that seem unlikely, remote, but very catastrophic. So just as an aside, Europeans have to have defense plans against the Russian Federation that assume zero US assistance or maybe even US sabotage. But so closing that parenthesis, I think it is likelier than not that the US will continue to play the game it's currently playing, which is one is to withdraw assistance and effectively do something that one could call removing irritants to the Russians. So you stop doing active policies that directly annoy the Russians. So you abolish USAID. You stop helping the Ukrainians, and potentially you also threaten the other Europeans with withdrawing American assistance from them if they don't play along. Then there's the question of rescuing the Russian economy, which can still be presented not at all in a manner which is innocent, but nevertheless, after all, it's just business, and you could simply say that it's a normalization of relations, which I think is what the Trump admin is going to do. And Rubio said as much in Saudi Arabia already a couple of weeks ago. So they're going to normalize diplomatic relations. They're going to look for economic opportunities together. And this will help the Russian war economy, of course. This will give the Russian economy hard currency reserves again. Bear in mind that the National Welfare Fund of the Russian Federation has exhausted its euro position. It doesn't have dollar positions anymore. It's all yuan and gold as far as the mobile assets go. But if trade between Russia and the United States were to resume, then logically as well, you would expect the US to lift some of the export controls, so some of the restrictions on very useful dual-use goods. Or alternatively, this would maybe be even more Putinesque or Trumpian, would be to officially not lift the export controls, but to give instructions to the intelligence community in the United States to close their eyes in the face of new front organizations that would pop up and that would basically do an illicit trade of certain useful dual-use goods, military grade electronics or what have you, that could flow to the Russians and help them. So I think that latter scenario is probably quite likely. Actually openly lifting the export controls restrictions would create more of a scandal with allies. Or they could do it and then reverse it, or they could say they're considering it. I mean, I see the Trump regime very much testing the waters, doing scandalous things, occasionally stepping back. It's sort of they're on a learning curve of how quickly they can betray their allies. I mean, look at the tariffs with Canada. I think that's also an interesting case. But I see the Trump regime very much going in the direction you suggest. And the question for them, I think the actual question they ask themselves is rather, how do we do it tactically?
And this could apply to NATO as well. And it seems to me, and this has seemed to me the case for at least 6 months, that those who have been brought up institutionally within NATO and so on seem to place a lot of value in the institution itself, ignoring that actually the institutions only exist because of the trust that is, loaned those institutions by their members. In that case, I've heard people say that no, US cannot withdraw from NATO, etc. Article 5 still holds. It seems to me that all Trump has to do is to sign a preemptive statement of intent, a preemptive executive order saying they're minded to withdraw from NATO, and then it's done. And then, it doesn't even have to be legally ratified. Trust has been withdrawn. And if there was a case, let's say, that the Baltics were overrun, the US could simply withhold, for a variety of reasons, withhold, any support to protect that or react. Is this too catastrophic, or are we still delusional, actually, that such institutions such as NATO have not just any deterrence power, but any power to strike back, let's say, kinetically, if Russia's plans expand?
That's a complex question, and as your listeners may have understood, I was a NATO official for 6 years, so I do know how the place works. I don't know everything about how it works because it's a complex beast, but I know some of it. Fundamentally, yes, trust. So look, NATO is not an automatic machine. It's not an automaton. Decisions are taken by the highest political level. Article 5 is a strong commitment, but it's not an automatic launch and everybody is at war. It's not quite like that. It is a political commitment for every ally to come to the aid militarily to any member that would face an armed attack. That's the spirit of Article 5. In practice, how would it play out exactly? I'm not sure that Trump necessarily would need to make a spectacular declaration about withdrawing from NATO. It would create a lot of chaos in the Congress. I think it might be easier for him to signal more discreetly that, and I think he's already doing that in effect, that the commitment is not completely solid, while also having some of his officials and even himself saying that the commitment is solid. So basically playing on uncertainty and ambiguity, which is what is happening now. When Pete Hegseth came to Brussels for the meeting of NATO defense ministers, he said the commitment is solid. When Trump was meeting Zelensky, that notorious meeting where they had their blow up, he actually said to the press, no, we're serious about NATO. We absolutely would protect Poland. When he was asked about the Baltic states, he had a bizarre facial expression, which I suggest people should study. And then he said, no, but we're solid on NATO. So he can say that, and maybe because it's expedient for him to say that. But I think, again, we need to explore more complex scenarios. For example, let's say the Russians launch a lightning attack into the Baltic states. The US could simply be, quote unquote, too slow to come and help. And Trump could say, but there's an urgent need for diplomacy, otherwise it's World War III, and we'll have a nuclear exchange. So let's save peace. And then who knows? Maybe he would sign off on part of Baltic sovereignty. And while still pretending that he did honor Article 5, he could say all sorts of things. I mean, the thing is that he's created uncertainty as to his true intentions and his true loyalties. And that's the fundamental problem. On the European side, if you're a European government at this point, you do not want to say anything that suggests that NATO is dead or Article 5 is dead. So you're going to continue working through NATO in case it does continue to work and in case it would work, and you don't want to signal to Russia that it's all over and that NATO no longer exists, because that's dangerous. So you pretend that everything is fine, and you work hard to make sure that everything will be fine, and you work as closely as possible, like before, with the American colleagues in every area of defense planning, intelligence sharing, everything else. But what you have to do as a European is that you start to open up a plan B that you don't discuss with the Americans, and you think, okay, worst case scenario, what happens if one of these crazy scenarios of American abandonment actually happens to us? What do we do then? And that's the work the Europeans need to do. But they do not benefit as governments from saying openly and publicly that NATO is finished. So they're not going to say that. And of course, there is absolutely a residual hope, an earnest hope, that effectively Trump, quote unquote, only wants to betray one country, but not other countries, right? Which, if you're a member of the public, seems crazily optimistic.
Seems like
But
divide and conquer, actually. That's reminiscent of Russia's imperial strategy to an extent.
oh yes, but I mean, and I think, there's many layers to this question, because Ukraine is not Ukraine doesn't have a strong place in the hearts and minds of the average American voter, but I would contend that Great Britain or France or Germany are quite different. I think especially the UK. I cannot imagine the Trump regime doing well if, let's say, the UK came under a Russian attack, I mean, an armed attack, and the US tries not to help. I think the US system would implode. Um, I hope that that's not wishful thinking on my part, but I actually think Trump could be overthrown over something like this. And actually, maybe we should work on that. Maybe we should work on, having contacts with US colleagues, obviously in secret, to make sure that, listen, if he betrays us, he's gone. And you promise me that, you Democrats, you remnants of normal people inside the intelligence services, remnants of people inside the armed forces who are normal. Because I mean, we can't put all of our eggs in the basket of negotiating with Trump, the individual, and putting up with his whims and not being sure whether he's a Russian asset or not. I mean, that's just intolerably insecure.
It's fascinating because it seems that Bismanov's theory actually holds more. I mean, I'm in various groups, and unfortunately, Americans are still busy screaming at each other or asking the question, is it dictatorship? Is it not? I think it's only at the point where people categorically decide that it's on a trajectory to dictatorship, they may do something about it. But talking of this idea of coups, of course, Russia has always said that this is what America is like. It fosters coups, it's an imperial power, it's blah blah blah, and it created this sort of caricature of the US, ignoring huge amounts of sort of US behavior, which are extremely positive, and the sort of order and peace that has been established in the Second World War. Not only is Trump dismantling that, there is also an article in Politico that it seems that they are trying to foment regime change in Ukraine in order to, and it's, I think, categorically clear, to weaken the country and get leaders who are prepared to capitulate to some of the worst and harshest demands of Putin. How can Europe and especially Britain help to guard against this? Because to my mind, it's catastrophic, and there are quite a few pro-Ukraine Republicans who unfortunately are falling into what seems to be a Russian operation to get calls for Zelensky to be removed amplified.
I think European governments have a duty to politely disagree with those attempts. In a sense, they already have, but in a manner which is maybe a bit too indirect. So a number of European leaders have said openly that they support Zelensky and that they support Ukraine. That was sort of the counter push after the Oval Office éclat. But I think it may be interesting and may be worthwhile for certain European governments, maybe those who feel slightly less vulnerable, to actually publicly disagree with Trump and see what happens. What I mean by publicly disagree is to say it could be something like, well, we are aware of certain US efforts to try to replace Zelensky in Ukraine, and we find that these are deeply wrong and we fully disagree, or words to that effect, and just see what happens. A country like Spain or Portugal could do that and not suffer much in terms of consequences, and it would hit the US media and it would put pressure on the White House. Because what can the US do really to hurt Spain or Portugal? This is just a suggestion. But indeed, I mean, we fundamentally anyway, when there's this type of attack, the line of defenses in Ukraine and among Ukrainians, we have to count on Ukrainian unity and patriotism under the current circumstances. But we also have to be aware of the fact that the Americans may not stop there, because it's one thing to have talks with Tymoshenko or whoever other ambitious person within the Ukraine system who might want to take the bait. The other problem is America's enormous financial resources. I mean, America has enough money to completely turn Ukrainian society upside down. It's a wartime economy, and even before the war, it's a country with relatively low average wages. And so that's something that's going to be very, very difficult to guard against. But perhaps Western governments could help the Ukrainian colleagues in terms of anti-corruption efforts in a new way, and maybe even with intelligence or intelligence sharing, to make sure that we can, well, try to push back against dark money inflows from the US into Ukraine, because I think that's coming.
So this is Russian vranyo backed by US dollars, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. And it basically means the United States. I think that, frankly, under the Trump regime, I see the United States as an apprentice of Putinism and Putinization. I don't want to be too dark, but frankly, there's so many data points that line up. I think we have to consider that possibility. I mean, first of all, they talk a lot all the time, and Trump admitted as much. At the very same meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky, he made it clear he was talking with Putin really a lot. And we know that he was talking with Putin while he was still a candidate. And the multiple channels of communication, obviously, including secondary channels like Tucker Carlson going to Moscow, what was it, a year ago or something. So,
And
so
there's
there's
Orban as well.
and
Orban
there's
clearly
Orban, etc.
communicates, yeah, with
So they
them.
have, and anyway, now that Trump is in power, he can do whatever he wants. They can communicate through the embassy, like, because the policy is changing. But they have lots of phone calls. The point is that, and also, I mean, if you take somebody like Tulsi Gabbard and make her chief head of national intelligence, director of national intelligence, excuse me, DNI, that's also extremely ominous. Because she's well known for her pro-Russian and pro-Assad narratives over the years. And I mean, giving her that job means giving the keys to the intelligence castle to someone who's pro-Russian. And obviously, Trump wanted to do that. And it's obviously a reward and a signal towards Vladimir Putin that the US is going to play ball. But going further with the learning process, what concerns me actually is if you look at the pattern of how Trump is effectively launching economic warfare against and economic bullying against Canada, there are elements that are pretty Putinist to this. So not the Putin that invades in February 2022, but the Putin of 2006 who cuts off the gas, the Putin of 2009 who cuts off the gas to Ukraine, etc., or even the Putin of 2013 who does a trade embargo on Ukraine to try to take it off its trajectory towards an agreement with the EU. So I see some of that going on. I mean, Trump is obviously aware of the fact that just like Russia was bullying its neighbors in those years, using economic instruments and subversion and so on, America is now doing against its neighbors. And in a sense, there's an aggressor's logic to this, or a bully's logic, in that, and it's the opposite of the traditional American spirit that we appreciate and we came to know in the last 80 years. And that is that you don't hit back the hardest at the bad guy. You hit the hardest on the weakest, on the one who is the most dependent on you, because that's how you can gain the most. It's a logic of a psychopathic aggressor or of an abuser, like Putin. And that's what I see in these pressures against Mexico and Canada, and also regarding Greenland. And so this is a completely new direction. Maybe some people would detect some of that in old US foreign policy from the 19th century, perhaps, or very early 20th century. But it's certainly new since 1945 that America is throwing its weight around so aggressively in its immediate neighborhood. It looks very Russian. It looks very, very Putinesque. But the thing is, there is method to this kind of thing. So you try to move very fast. I studied Russian economic coercion as a topic. I reported about it actually when I was working at NATO. One thing that's very characteristic with how Russia bullied its neighbors using economic tools back 10, 15 years ago, when that was its main instrument, was the fact that you use surprise, deception, very high speed. So basically, you're really trying to punch the lights out of your own neighbor deliberately on purpose by surprise. You basically, as the Americans would say, you're trying to sucker punch your victim. Because if you're in the business of transforming your economy, reducing the trade deficit, having an industrial policy, you would never act the way Trump acts. You would never introduce the tariffs so aggressively and under false pretenses and as fast as possible and by surprise and in violation of an existing trade agreement that you yourself negotiated and signed just a few years ago. So this clearly shows that Trump is using uh, effectively Russian methods of coercion. They're very, very similar. And so maybe he's being schooled. Maybe Trump is the ultimate apprentice. He is Putin's apprentice.
Yes, it has terrible echoes of sci-fi and fantasy, unfortunately, and I think people will know sort of what I'm referring to there. But it has real-world consequences because the withdrawal of intelligence data, it seems that already, even within 24 hours of that being announced, there was a massive strike on Kryvyi Rih, and potentially the casualties were higher than they would have been had that intelligence data still been online. It's likely that Trump's decisions, even in the short term, are going to lead to innumerable deaths and casualties that could have been prevented. Let's tackle that first, and then we'll conclude with where this could be going in terms of what kind of peace might be foisted on Ukraine, if any.
Well, if you mean the casualties, then I think, without going into the details of that particular incident, I mean, it's still being interpreted. My very rapid understanding was that indeed US suspending intelligence sharing has affected also early warning capacities for airstrikes against civilians. And maybe that we'll see media articles denying this, and or some of them saying yes, it did have that effect, or no, it didn't. But the point is this: what we already know with certainty is that Trump doesn't care about civilian lives in Ukraine, doesn't care about civilian lives anywhere else for that matter. Um, Not even sure he cares that much about civilian lives in his own country. But he knows that that hurts, and he knows that that's a way to untwist other people. So I think he has, in my mind, the understanding of a psychopath. So sort of someone who doesn't have the empathy, but he knows that that thing hurts, and he knows that one can gain power by allowing violence to be exerted. I mean, one needs to look at the brutality of Trump's words towards Zelensky. No normal human talks that way to a country that is being bombed every day, and having its soldiers die every day at the front, defending the homeland from invasion. Nobody talks that way except for psychopaths on the one hand, or people who are vicariously psychopaths, or the actual aggressor. So, even if you think it's not our war, not in our interest, or could be indirectly dangerous for us, so please, you guys make peace, you would simply not say to the public, to the American public, well, he'd better negotiate, otherwise he won't have a country. That really shows a callousness of heart, which is extremely alarming. And I think we should not underestimate that side of Trump. I think that he is really genuinely massively indifferent, more so than other political leaders, massively indifferent to human suffering, and that should inform how we approach him.
And he's also hinted that Zelensky won't be around forever, or not just the the life of the country is at balance, but I think there are some sinister hints there that Zelensky himself may be under some threat. In fact, we know for a fact that Russia has attempted to assassinate him multiple times. The most catastrophic fear I have is that the US, with its intelligence resources, could weigh in to try and make that happen as a way of shortcutting to their strategy, which is peace at any price.
Um, who knows? To be entirely honest, I hadn't even thought about that possibility.
I'm
That the
afraid
United
my
States would.
mind goes to dark places, but I think that's a
I think we're better off nowadays allowing our minds to go to dark places while superimposing then after that a rational analysis to see, okay, well, what can we do about it to mitigate harm and dangers? But it's okay to consider very dark scenarios. I agree. What I was seeing so far was more sort of a non-kinetic, non-violent US agitation against Zelensky. And while the Russians, yes, probably do continue to try to assassinate him and do try to promote treasonous forces from within Ukraine. My main worry now was the Americans putting a ton of money into Ukraine to subvert it politically. This, I think, is likelier, but you're quite right. I would not. I think you're right to have that dark thought for the following reason. Think about this. Um, Trump has withdrawn Secret Service protection from former senior US officials that he doesn't like. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, very serious, solid, conservative, patriotic Americans who served him and who did a lot of the things he wanted. Of course, who also stood up to him, but nevertheless, good public servants, especially if you have a conservative view. And he just removes their protection. He's basically saying, well, if some sort of crazy Iranian killer squad manages to get you, well, that's on you, or you pay for your own private security. And that's public information. Now, I don't think that Trump would be passive if an Iranian killer squad really did assassinate John Bolton on US soil. I think that would be quite the incident. Um, but it does show that Trump does not hesitate to put extraordinary pressure against people he doesn't like or who stood up to him. And Zelensky is clearly in that category now. Hence the very insistent calls for Zelensky to apologize and to grovel. And in that sense, Trump is also very similar to Vladimir Putin. So not only a personalist, dictator type of personality, but also someone who forces people down to their knees to apologize. And Putin does that sort of thing to a very shocking degree. He's done it many times. People sometimes forget, but he forced Alexander Litvinenko's father to apologize for his assassinated son having been a traitor to Russia. He made the Putin assassinated a defector and then forced the defector's father to apologize to him on Russian television. So that's the extent, and I fear that Trump is rather similar, and that the Trump-Putin friendship or bromance, which is continuing, can only encourage that Trump to behave that way, because Trump obviously thinks, well, that's how proper strongmen behave,
And
and
when the
that's the
worst
code.
happens, thoughts and prayers aren't going to bring that person back, and you can pretend you had nothing to do with it with a little smirk on your face, such as when Nemtsov was murdered in sight of the Kremlin, which is, the most symbolic of assassinations.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think but to get back to your point, I think indeed that Zelensky's life may be now in greater danger than before. That's a fair point. Um, And I think here European governments should make it clear to the American colleagues that we we really would have a massive problem if we ever learned that anything of that nature has been facilitated by the US government. I think just in case, I think it may be worth going purely through diplomatic channels, not in public. But if there are any doubts about that scenario, they should be expressed. There should be pressure before the event, not after.
The last question here is what can we expect in the coming weeks? Because of course the puppet show, the theatre of Trump's maximalist threats and then rowing back and then rowing forward, there's a whole piece of theatre going on there, which is sort of smoke and mirrors to distract. Underlining it, it seems, at least to me and some of those that are say looking at this in a non-partisan way in the US, that Trump is going to try to, over a series of steps, like a sort of salami slicing process, force Ukraine to adopt more and more and more concessions from Russia. I've been looking to, the Istanbul Agreement as a sort of as guidance for that. But I think before we hit record, you indicated that actually maybe that's not it. If Putin feels that he's winning, then his concessions, demand for concessions, may be even greater than what were articulated in Istanbul.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Russia reserves the right to redefine the terms all the time, and they do so all the time. And to begin with, they invaded in February 2022, when the pre-existing basis was the Minsk agreement. So agreements with Russia mean nothing. What Russia says in negotiations, that's meaningless as well. Russia has maximalist goals, and that's viewed through their actions. They try to invade and occupy the entire country. They would no doubt have basically decapitated the entirety of Ukraine's elites, national elites, had they captured Kiev in 2022. I think that's pretty clear. And they would have annexed, maybe not just the four regions, but maybe additional regions, and left the rest as a rump state controlled by puppet government. Possibly other countries could have joined in, encouraged by Russia, like Hungary, hacking off bits of territory. Maybe the Ukraine state as a whole would have simply ceased to exist, or maybe Putin would have decided all of a sudden, no, I want to keep the appearance of a Ukrainian state after all. So basically, Putin will do exactly what he wants to do when he wants it, to the degree that he can. And that's the only fixed point that we can count on in the analysis. And therefore, the policy for Ukraine has to remain the same, and the policy for friends of Ukraine has to remain the same. And that is that Ukraine's ability and strength to push back must be maximized. And look, I mean, the best interest of Europe, we have to just say it clearly. The best interest of Europe actually is not to rush towards peace, but it is to give maximal assistance to Ukraine so that the Ukrainians, as long as they want to, are able to continue the fight. Because the longer the fight goes on, assuming Ukraine is properly supplied, of course, the longer that fight goes on, the higher the chances are that we could start to see cracks in the Russian system, in the Russian economy, in the motivation of the Russian soldiers that are being mobilized. The Russians don't have a well-organized resistance movement, unfortunately, but like any society and any system, it is not indestructible. They can come into problems. They could have mass desertions. They could have a failing economy. They could have all sorts of problems. But we won't find out if we just reward them now and walk away and lift sanctions and go for a dictated peace. And that's, I think, the real tragedy of the situation here. If the US wanted to, together with Europe, we could engineer probably a strategic defeat of the Russian Federation and teach the Russian state the lesson that it needs to be taught, which is that territorial aggression is unacceptable and that you will pay an extremely heavy price if you engage in it. And what is happening now is the opposite. Trump is doing the exact opposite, which is dangerous for every small and medium-sized state in the world. This is dangerous. The only people who benefit from that new universe are basically superpowers and countries that have enormous nuclear arsenals, because they're the only ones who can benefit from such a new world order. And so my hope is that the Ukrainians, as long as they have the stomach to fight and can produce their own weapons and drones and so on, and as long as we in Europe are willing to help them, we should bend over backwards to help them more and as much as we possibly can. And to, if there is a negotiation, then let it take time, and let it be so that cracks begin to appear in the Russian system, so that the Russians begin to show concessions. And unless and until we see clear offers of concessions from Putin communicated to Ukraine or reliably to European governments, then I don't see what we're negotiating about except a forced surrender and what one would call in German a Diktatfrieden, a dictated peace, which is no peace at all.
Edward, thank you so much for those clear and strong words. This has been an interview I've looked forward to for a long time. It also, I think, is exactly the right moment to have this conversation. So thank you so much for coming on the channel.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much, Jonathan.